and good evening, everybody, to the Durham Castle Lecture Series. I know there's a few new faces here tonight, including academics, students, and also community groups, including some from rape crisis centres. Welcome all to the grandness of the Great Hall of Durham's Durham Castle, which is an important and central part of Durham University, which is equally important and centrality of the topic that I know is incredibly important to many of us in the room tonight. Issues relating to sexuality, to sexual freedom, to sexual violence, and anti-violence work more generally. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Nicole Westmarland, and I'm a Professor of Criminology here at the University, where I co-direct the Durham University Centre for Research into Violence and Abuse. I have a particular interest in sexual violence, having previously chaired Rape Crisis England and Wales for a number of years, and therefore was delighted to be invited by Professor David Held, Master of University College, to chair this lecture this evening. It is therefore my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Jaclyn Friedman. Jaclyn is an American feminist writer, performer and activist. She is Executive Director of Women Activist Action and the Media, which is a non-profit making organisation in North America dedicated to developing gender justice in the media. She is the co-editor of Yes Means Yes, Visions of Female Sexual Power and a World Without Rape, and the author of What You Really Want, the Smart Girl's Shame-Free Guide to Sex and Safety. With Women, Action and Media, Jaclyn led a highly successful campaign for Facebook to recognise gender-based hate speech as violating its own policies, a campaign which I know a lot of British campaigners were actively supporting. I'll stop there in case I'm overlapping with the first few minutes of Jaclyn's talk and invite her to the podium. Welcome, Jaclyn Friedman.
Thank you, everyone. I have to say the invitation to address you all tonight here is one of the more extraordinary that I've received, and I'm really quite honored to be here. And I'm looking forward to having a really robust conversation after my remarks as well. I wanted to start just with a little bit of background on me and then launch headlong into my subject material. I started my work in this field as an anti-sexual violence activist, as an anti-rape activist, after I myself was sexually assaulted during my undergraduate years, more years ago than I'd like to count. And I did that work for a long time from a strictly no means no place. And no means no is an incredibly important principle that many, many activists worked years to make sure that most people understood, right? That if your sexual partner is objecting, you must stop. It's an important principle. But the more I did the work, and the deeper I got into it, I and many others like me came to realize that it was necessary but not sufficient for truly consensual sexual interactions. That in fact, we had to have a yes means yes model. And that's the title that my first book was based on. Here it is. And that's going to be the framework that I'm going to be exploring with you tonight and that we can talk more about afterwards. But in order to talk about where I'd like to see us go in terms of sexual ethics, we have to talk about where we are now, where we're starting from. So we're going to spend a little time in the beginning talking about the sexual culture as it is, largely in the US as well as the UK, a dominant Western narrative about sex, which also extends far beyond our borders, but also has exceptions within our borders as well. So this is an incident that happened recently in the US. A couple of reality stars made a sex tape, and American comedian Steve Harvey, who I should point out has no formal education in anything related to sexuality or violence prevention, decided he had an opinion on it. He's also published a very well-selling book on relations between the genders called Think Like a Man, Act Like a Lady, I think. And he basically said that the sex tape was wrong for the woman, for Mimi to have produced, because her sex is a precious jewel that all men are after. And this is really a perfect distillation of what I and others call the commodity model of sexuality, right? Which is very familiar, I think, probably to most people in this room. It's the model that says, if you're a woman, the most precious thing, your most precious jewel, is your sexuality, and specifically your sexual innocence, right? And that you must save it because it's the most valuable thing you own until you can make the best trade possible for it, which of course is for a man to marry you, right? Always going to be a man. This is a strictly heteronormative model. Right? Nobody exists outside of men and women, and they only want to pair with the opposite gender. And of course, if you're a man in this model, what your responsibility is to get the sex from women for as little as possible, because you're the buyer in this model. You're supposed to ideally not give out your phone number if possible. I happen to think this insults everyone, because we're all much more complex beings than this. It also leads to a lot of damaging tropes in our culture. So example, if someone were to ask me if they could have sex with me and I said no, and then they asked me again and I said no, and this goes on for 40 times, and the 42nd time I'm like, you know what, whatever, fine. That's fair game under the commodity model, right? It doesn't matter how I feel about it. It doesn't matter that it's located in my body and I'm having an experience. It's a business deal, and I said yes, contract signed, right? And if I am not paying attention and someone comes and takes something from me without without asking in advance, people are going to say, well, you didn't look after yourself well enough, right? A lot of the victim blaming comes from this commodity concept as well. Other things like our virginity fetish. This is a woman who a few years ago auctioned off her virginity on the internet for $2 million. There is no reason on earth that virginity, female virginity, does anyone think male virginity would go for $2 million? No, it's laughable, right? That specifically female virginity is only valuable in a commodity model, if female virginity is the commodity. Otherwise, you are paying $2 million to have sex with someone you don't know, about which the only thing you know is they don't know anything, right? Why would that be valuable as an experience? It's only valuable as a commodity. We also get things like the gatekeeper narrative. I know this slide is very old in terms of pop news, but it tells a story better than anything I've seen. So the story told here is about how Katy Perry forced Russell Brand to love her by withholding sex, right? This is a very common narrative under the commodity model. Women don't want sex for our own purposes. We only want love and commitment. Men don't want love and commitment. They only want sex. Women must bribe men, must blackmail men into loving us by withholding sex. Again, whatever your gender, I hope that you are insulted by this, right? It's pretty insulting to everybody. But the reason this particular slide stays in my slideshow, even though it's kind of old at this point, is because simultaneously as it's telling that story, you've got Katy Perry naked giving you the come fuck me look, right? And what that reveals, very elegantly actually, is that it's not enough as a woman to withhold and blackmail, but you also simultaneously have to be as sexually appealing an object, a commodity, as possible to have value, right? And I say this with no malice whatsoever. Divorce is terrible and I wish it on no one, but if Katy Perry couldn't pull this off, none of us have hope. Other things, this is an ad, this is a very commodity model ad from a men's magazine called Che. The fact that there's a men's magazine called Che is like a different lecture. But this is saying, the tagline, in case you can't read it, it's a little unclear, says, keep on dreaming of a better world. What's better for men, the audience of this ad, about the world depicted? You can control a whole woman, right? And not just any woman. She appears to be young, white, able-bodied, skinny, conventionally pretty. Not every body has the same value in the commodity model. We see this also in ads for the Tucker Max movie. I'm not going to explain Tucker Max to you Brits if you don't know who he is. I'll spare you. But it's important to see the way these jokes operate, right? Strippers will not tolerate disrespect, just kidding. It's hilarious because obviously in the commodity model, we can disrespect women who engage in sex work all we like because they don't respect themselves enough to wait to hold it for marriage, right? And so if they don't respect themselves, we can disrespect them. That's what's hilarious about this. Blind girls never see you coming. Does everyone see that that is a rape joke? Yes, that's hilarious, theoretically, because women who with certain physical disabilities have no sexual value whatsoever in the commodity marketplace, in this commodity model, and therefore we can make jokes about this. And I am sure that the extension of this joke would be they'd be lucky for the attention. So again, not every body has access to even equal value within the commodity model. And that leads to inevitably and constantly the devaluing of sexual violence, right? Everywhere, on every campus, in every community, because it gets treated like theft, right? If female sexuality is a commodity, then stealing it is bad, you shouldn't do it, but it is not, in fact, a truly life-altering violent crime, which is in fact the case. So this is just one in a long string of headlines about sentences not properly meted out to confessed or found guilty rapists. We find them all over the US, I'm sure you have them here. And it all stems directly from the devaluing of female sexual agency, which is kind of spoiling where we're gonna get in a little while. But I am not telling you all of this just to bum you out. I promise, I did not come here to bum you out. Your campus is way too beautiful for that. I came here to tell you that another paradigm is possible. Now, sometimes explaining that meets some resistance because we're so steeped in this commodity way of thinking about sexual interactions that it's sometimes like saying, did you know that there's something you could breathe other than air, right? That we don't even know we're living in a paradigm, let alone that it could shift. So I want to say I have empathy for those of you for whom these are new ideas. I hope that you'll think about them. I don't expect you to suddenly have a click moment and have your life changed. I'm sure you'll have questions and challenges about them, but I want you to entertain them. Instead of thinking about sex like a commodity exchange, we could, and I propose we should, think about sex like a musical jam session, right? This is not, we used to call this the performance model of sex, and people got very confused about the role of the audience, which is not the point. If the audience is consenting and everyone's into it, it's fine, but it's not necessary. So instead, I now call this the creative collaborative model of sex. So think about two musicians playing music together just for the joy of it in private, right? You know, if I say to one person, hey, do you want to play music with me? First of all, the first thing that's going to need to happen is we have to have a conversation, right? What instruments do you play? What instruments do I play? What kind of music do we like? What is off limits? Where should we play, right? We have to have a whole negotiation, and no one's going to say we're killing the musical mood because we talk about it, right? And then we play music, we have a great time. My first jam partner says, you know what, I gotta go, I'm a busy person, I got another place to be. I'm like, that's great, let's do this again sometime. But I still want to play, and maybe ask somebody else, hey, do you want to play music with me? Am I a music slut? No, it's a ridiculous idea, right? I'm probably pretty good because I practice a lot. So when we reframe sex, instead of as this commodity exchange, instead, if we frame it as a creative collaborative exchange between two or more people, so many of our damaging assumptions and beliefs about sex fall away. Does it matter what the gender of the players are? Not a bit. Nope. Does it matter how many players are, honestly? No, as long as everybody's into it, right? What matters is that there's a satisfying and productive, creative experience happening on the part of everyone who's playing there. And do you think anyone would pay $2 million to play music with someone who's never picked up an instrument before? No, of course not. You would have to find another beginner to figure things out with, or find someone who likes to teach, right? And if somebody kidnapped me and forced me to play music with them, would we discuss that largely as a musical act? A crime of music? No, it would be kidnapping, right? Very clear. And so all of that damaging stuff falls away. And one of the most important principles to get us to make that shift is an idea called enthusiastic or sometimes affirmative consent. How many of you have heard of this idea? I'm just curious. Raise your hands. Oh, good, excellent. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. In the commodity model, consent is conceived of like a light switch, right? Do you want to have sex with me? Yes, no. Now, of course, sex itself is not an instant occurrence, right? It's actually a process that takes place through the space-time continuum. And so this is wholly inadequate. And then, of course, when we bring up consent for women, usually in the commodity model, in reality, it's like a broken light switch, where if you say yes, and you're a woman, you don't get to say no anymore. And so that's even worse. Instead, under enthusiastic consent, instead of thinking of it like, I like the slide effects sometimes, sorry. I propose that we think about consent like synchronized swimming. So bear with me for a minute. Instead of having sex with someone, if you are synchronized swimming with them, you can't just get in the pool and get out of the pool and dance around on the side of the pool and say that you are synchronized swimming, can you? No. You will be disqualified. You will get all zeros from the judges. Similarly, you have to be surrounded and supported by active consent, and I'm going to define that a little more deeply in a moment. The entire time you're having sex or any kind of sexual interaction with a partner, right? That is what makes it a moral, ethical, consensual experience. Now that's a drag for a lot of people to think about because all we see modeled almost exclusively is the commodity model, and that means showing up for your partner, actually talking to your sex partner during sex. We don't see it modeled a lot, so it can feel pretty confusing. And I want to validate that. This is everyone's favorite slide. It's all downhill from here, I'm sorry. It can feel very confusing, and I just want to tell you if this feels scary or confusing or weird or awkward to you, you're normal, right? And that's not because there's something wrong with you, it's because there's something wrong with the culture that we're living in. And so because of that, I want to break this down a little more. Let's talk in more detail about how to do enthusiastic consent. The first thing that we have to do, and possibly the most challenging, is start with ourselves. We have to begin by figuring out what we ourselves actually want from sex and what we don't want from sex. And that can be a very unfamiliar question for most of us who got raised in a commodity model, and so regardless of who we are, what our actual lived experiences are, how we feel inside, it's completely gender prescribed, right? If you're a man, you want to hit it and quit it, right? If you're a woman, you want to save it for marriage, you know? And anything else is deviant in some way, or you should at least keep it under wraps. At least please don't talk about it in polite company. So it really is a project, and in fact, when I toured for Yes Means Yes, the number one question, which discussed enthusiastic consent quite a bit, the number one question I got was, I really love this idea, but I don't know how to know what I want to say or not, yes or no to. And that's in fact why I wrote my second book, which is a book that has full of exercises to help you figure out what you want from sex. Now, when I say start with yourself, I don't mean finish with yourself, right? You will never finish knowing what you want from sex. It's going to change by day, by partner, and also over the long-term arc of your life. But getting involved in the process of asking yourself that is the first step in enthusiastic consent. Next, and most importantly, I think, only yes means yes, right? So laying there passively does not mean your partner is consenting. I don't care what gender they are, right? I hope you'll notice that this applies in all directions for all genders, right? We're going to be talking quite a bit throughout about asymmetries in power relationships between men and women, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't all have the same basic moral obligations to each other, regardless of what gender pairings are occurring. Only yes means yes. Only if your partner is actually actively into whatever is happening at that moment should you continue doing it. And now here's the tricky part. If you can't tell, you have to ask. So let's break this down for a minute. Consent in the enthusiastic consent model can be revoked at any time, which makes perfect sense when you recognize, of course, that sex is a process and not a light switch, right? I might say yes to do something sexual with someone, and then I get a leg cramp and I need to stop, right? It's not a moral judgment on anybody. I might say yes to doing something with somebody and discover they're not very good at it. Maybe I want to do something else now. Maybe I discover they're so good at it, I'm so turned on, I have to get to the next thing. I have to get that thing now, right? Whatever, it doesn't matter what your reasons are, right? So just because someone said yes to do a thing with you in a moment doesn't mean they're even consenting on going to that thing. What does that mean? You have to pay attention to your partner. We have this weird belief that we should be thinking and talking about sex with everybody except for the people we're actually fucking. It's bizarre, right? But in fact, it's not that hard to make it sexy, right? Really just drop your voice an octave. And if it comes out funny, then laugh, because sex can also be inherently ridiculous, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're not doing it wrong if it's funny once in a while, right? The important thing is that you have to show up. You have to be present for your partner as a fully fledged human being, and you have to pay attention to whether they're still into what's happening. I'm going to assume that everyone in this room who made time to come to this lecture tonight wants to only have sex with people who are into it, right? So this is just a framework for you to make sure you're doing that, something you already want to do. It involves something that will feel awkward because you're new at it, which is checking in with your partner. Does that feel good? This is what is involved, right? The people who freak out about this idea will tell you it's about, may I have a contract to touch your left breast? And then there's like a notary in the corner. Do you have notaries here? It's not it. It's just about staying in active communication. Now, if you're sleeping with someone who you've been with for a long time, some of this can be nonverbal, right? But it depends on how confident you are that you're genuinely sure you know what it would look like if they were or weren't into it. So if you're with a new partner, you're going to have to do a lot more talking. Continuous consent, as we discussed, right? And then this is maybe the most controversial and least discussed part of enthusiastic consent, but in my opinion, you're voiding enthusiastic consent if you're actively lying about the conditions of the sex, right? This isn't about being psychic. You are not responsible to psychically know what your partner needs to know in order to decide to have sex with you, right? And you're also welcome to say, that's not your business or that's not an appropriate question, right? That's also fine. But if your partner says, do you have any sexually transmitted infections? And you say, I have been tested for all of them, and I have none. First of all, you should know that person is lying because you can't be tested for all of them. But second of all, if you're making that lie, you are voiding that person's ability to meaningfully consent, right? If you're telling someone you're being monogamous with them and you're not being monogamous with them, you're voiding their ability to meaningfully consent. I doubt there is a court that would convict you, right? This is not about a legal standard. I'm not sure I would even advocate for a court that would convict you on this particular principle. But you are not acting as an ethical human being with your partner. And, you know, I'm assuming all of you want to be ethical human beings. So I know all of this sounds probably pretty unfamiliar and like a lot of work. And it makes you feel anxious. A lot of you are at the beginning of your sexual careers, hoping you have long and healthy lives. Again, I want you to tell you, if you're feeling those things, you are in the majority, I'm guaranteeing you in this room, right? But I want you to try to do it anyway. A, it gets easier with practice. And B, the alternative to having sex this way is what I like to call it just happened sex. Probably you know what this is like, right? You have a friend who has maybe once said, I don't know, we were at a party and we were kind of drinking and then it just kind of happened. How many of you have heard that from another person sometime? Yes, the rest of you are lying. It just happened sex, first of all, is crappy sex. And we've been misled by the commodity model messages to think that the goal is to have quantity sex, right? That sex is some sort of accomplishment or achievement or a collectible, right? We want to have more of it and put it on our shelf, trophies, right? That's a really miserable way to have sex. You have not been adequately prepared, I'm betting, that sex should be awesome. Right? Ultimately, sex should be great. If your friend says, hey, I had sex with so-and-so last night, your immediate response should not be, awesome, right? Your immediate response should be, how was it, right? The fact of the sex is not an accomplishment, right? Human beings have been having sex. You're not accomplishing anything new, I promise you. Even these guys, I bet some of them, I'm just saying. They're gonna kick me out now, aren't they? You should expect great sex, and it just happens sex where you are abdicating any responsibility for the fact that you are having sex is almost guaranteed to be crappy sex. You're not paying attention to your partner, you're not speaking up for your own needs and desires and boundaries, you're having crappy checked out sex. That's the best case scenario, right? The worst case scenario, if you do this over and over again, if this is your basic modus operandi, is that you're teaching yourself something terrible. You're teaching yourself that your needs and desires and boundaries don't matter, right? Why would you do that to yourself? That's a terrible, mean thing to do to yourself. And also it makes you vulnerable if you encounter somebody else who believes the same thing, right? That your needs and desires and boundaries don't matter. Now, if they do something to hurt you, it's still their fault. I want to be perfectly clear about that. But why would you want to make yourself more vulnerable in that place? Now, of course, I'm getting very close to talking about hooking up, right? Do people over here clutch their pearls about the hookup culture? Is that a thing, or is that just an American narrative? Yes, I'm getting nods, okay. I went to a school in Canada and they were like, we don't know what you're talking about. I was like, how is that anyway. So the thing I have to say about the hookup culture, the whole framing, is that it's bullshit, right? First of all, you are not the first generation to drink and have sex. I'm sorry to break it to you, I'm sure you're innovators in other ways. Second of all, does anyone think when anyone's clutching their pearls about kids these days hooking up that they're worried about young men having casual sex? Anybody? No, and that's how you know this is a sexist load of crap. Instead of talking about the hookup culture, there are important things to talk about. But what I want to tell you is, it's not about casual sex, right? There's plenty of solid social research that shows if person A and person B engage in a casual sexual encounter, and both of them, what they wanted going into it was a casual sexual encounter, and they practice enthusiastic consent, they probably had a great time, and neither one of them is psychologically damaged by it, even if they're a girl, right? What the damage comes in when the desires are mismatched, when one person maybe wants a casual encounter and the other doesn't, but doesn't feel like they have enough social power for whatever set of reasons, which could be varied, to say no, right? But that's not casual sex is bad, right? That's predatory behavior, coercion, like patriarchy, God forbid I should say it, is bad, right? That's not the fault of casual sex. These bad interactions happen in relationships too. Instead of talking about the hookup culture, we should maybe talk about alcohol and sex, right? This is a real topic of conversation that does not involve what gender you are. I'm going to say a few things, and then I'm going to actually pause briefly to see if anyone has a question, which I know is really off program, but I want to make sure we're on the same page about this before we proceed. First, I'll say there's nothing wrong with having a couple of drinks and having sex. It can be a lot of fun. We get, I think, maybe too rigid about this idea. The problem is being incapacitated by alcohol and having sex, or otherwise being too drunk to really have a meaningful ability to consent to what's happening. Now, the reality is many of you may also be at the beginning of your drinking careers, as well as your sexual careers, again, assuming you're going to have long and happy lives. Which means you're going to maybe have to play it a little safe. If you are not sure if you've had too much to drink to have sex with someone, or if your partner has had too much drink to meaningfully consent to you, that's your answer, right? That's the answer. It's really that simple. People make this idea out to be very complicated, but it's that simple. If you're unsure, the answer is no. Otherwise, you're asking a question about getting away with sex, right? My partner has had this much to drink, and it's been this long, and she's 5'2", and she had this much to eat. Can I, right? And if you're asking about getting away with sex with someone, you may or may not be a rapist, but that's a rapey question, right? That is a rapey commodity model attitude about acquiring some sex from someone who can't really put up a disagreement. So I'm assuming everyone here wants to be a moral, awesome person and not vaguely rapey. To which case I say, like, you're probably, if one or both of you is too drunk to consent, it's probably going to be crappy sex anyway, right? You're probably not going to remember it that well. Someone's going to be sort of maybe participating. Like, you're not even having that good a time. Like, why risk hurting someone? And this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pause and see if we're all on the same page. The question I get constantly is this, and I'm just going to answer it because I get it so often I don't even wait for it to be asked anymore. What if both people are drunk? Are they raping each other? Yes, people recognize this question. Yes, it's like my greatest hits. Here's my answer to that question. Imagine instead of having sex, you'll notice I do a lot of metaphor switches so that we can get out of our sexual paradigms. Instead of having sex, person A and person B, who are both seriously drunk, both get in respectively into their respective vehicles or 2 cars, and they both respectively try to make it to their respective separate homes, right? And then person A, at some point on the journey, crashes their car into person B's car, and person B is quite injured. Who is the person who was hurt? Right? It's a dumb question, person B, right? No one would ask that question. And the same goes for sexual assault, right? If 2 people are solidly drunk and have sex, if someone got hurt, it's the person who says, I got hurt, right? That's the person who's hurt, right? It is possible to have 2 people be totally drunk and have sex with each other and nobody gets hurt. But it's also possible that person A and person B drive drunkenly their cars home and nobody gets hurt. Does that make it a good idea? Does that make them moral actors? No, that makes them lucky assholes, right? Who probably should not try that again because they might not be so lucky the next time. So there's nothing inherent to the state of being drunk that means somebody is being raped. It's just a terrible risk. And why would you take it? Do people have questions or comments? Does everyone generally understand this? Nod, shake your head. Okay, you can also put a pin in it and leave it, but I don't want anyone sitting there sort of burning with something before we move on. The other thing that we should talk about when instead of talking about the hookup culture is, in fact, predatory sexual behavior. People taking advantage of or creating and then taking advantage of uneven social dynamics to do harm to other people sexually. And here I want to go, as the title promised, beyond consent, and talk about the sort of assumptions that underlie the commodity model versus the creative collaborative model. The assumption when it comes to sexual violence in the commodity model about who deserves protection is one that's about innocence, right? The core question in the commodity model is, did the person deserve it or not, right? Was the person, and we say, oh, an innocent victim. It's like, it's almost a tautology to say innocent victim, right? And I think the innocence framework is both bullshit and very dangerous. Because many of us, most of us, if we lived our lives for 3 minutes, have done things that other people can decide make us not innocent, and therefore not worthy of protection. So I think we'd probably all agree that this sweet-looking child is innocent. But what about this sweet-looking child? Do we have Hunger Games fans in here? Yes, okay. For those of you who aren't, I'm going to spoil a plot point. It's been out forever, so I'm not that sorry. This is the movie, when they made the movies, this is the casting choice for Rue. Rue is a really important character in the Hunger Games, and she's meant to represent innocence to our heroine Katniss. And specifically sort of the innocence of her sister, Katniss' sister, who she's trying to protect. I'm not going to tell you the whole plot, we don't have time for that. What I will tell you is that when she's described in the books very clearly as looking somewhat like this. They don't use the word black or African American because language doesn't exist in this particular universe, but she looks like this. It's pretty clear in the text. And when the casting was announced, some people said this: it's less sad that she dies, right? Her death is a pivotal plot point, right? It's less sad that she dies. Why? Why would that be? Well, we do know that women of color are assumed to be hypersexual at a very young age in most of the dominant culture, right? Are not afforded the idea of innocence the way pretty young white girls are. She's not assumed to be as innocent, it's not as sad. This is where the innocence question goes. We see that in other cases. This is a case that happened a couple of years ago where a 14-year-old boy coerced a 14-year-old girl, both of them black, into giving him a blowjob in front of his friends, one of whom had a video camera. The video went around the world, and everyone freaked out about, why did she not know better? Why did she do that? Where were her parents? No one, we don't even know the names of the boys who did this. They trafficked in child pornography. And I actually happened to talk about this case once in a room where someone from the town where this happened was and said, the boys were treated like heroes, right? What is that about? This is a 14-year-old black girl. She is not giving a blowjob. She is not afforded the idea of innocence. We don't take her victimization seriously. We see that when victims come forward, right? When DSK was accused of rape a few years ago, the victim came forward, and immediately almost there were sort of rumors flying that she was a sex worker, right? Sex workers not innocent, so we can dismiss her. We also see this show up in the gay panic or trans panic defenses. Are you familiar with this? This is the argument when a gay man or a trans woman usually, although not exclusively, are murdered, that basically, the person had come onto the perpetrator, the murderer, sexually, usually. And it was so upsetting, they so violated their expectations of innocence, right? And that they were lying, right? Never mind. And that's why I made a very clear distinction between active lying and this. This is not the same thing as the no lying clause. Everyone see the difference? Okay. That they deserve to be murdered. That's how not innocent they are, right? This happened last year. Now, the ABA, the American Bar Association, this happened in the US, is working to bar the use of the gay panic defense, which is great. But it also illustrates how we have to go sort of category by category and community by community and decide who can be included in innocence and who isn't. And it's always gonna be a leaky sieve, right? And there's always gonna be someone on the outside when we determine who we want to protect. And again, we're going to talk about the protection frame also, who we want to protect based on whether or not we think that they're worthy of our protection. It also is a clause or an idea that's taken advantage of by sexual perpetrators. So there's a really interesting study that came out recently that illustrated that men who are sexually aggressive with drunk women in bars usually are not drunk themselves, right? We read these situations as, oh, two people are drunk, it's a misunderstanding, and they sent research observers into a whole set of bars to observe these and found that most of the time the guys who are doing this are sipping soda water, right? And they're deliberately selecting drunk women. They're not targeting the sober women, right? So you see how they use the cover of not innocence, this is a drunk woman in a bar, right, to get away with their sexual predation. And we see this come out in the rape research as well. We know that on US campuses, the vast majority of rapes are committed by a tiny percentage of perpetrators who know what they're doing. They may not describe it to themselves as rape, but they know they don't have consent, it's a feature, not a bug, and they offend over and over again in order to account for all of those rapes. And we engage in what I like to call the myth of misunderstanding, right? We say, oh, it was probably, well, who can say, right? And then we release them back into our own communities and they offend over and over again. And so they're using, again, that sort of umbrella of innocence that the perpetrators of rape often use. Lots of the victim-blaming excuses are about lack of innocence, right? Oh, did you see those shoes she was wearing? Why did she go back there, right? Why was he doing that? When we focus on the victim's behavior, specifically sexual behavior, or walking in a dangerous neighborhood, or any number of things, we're saying, oh, well, they're not innocent enough to deserve our protection, and therefore we're going to release this rapist back into the community. It's absolutely insane when you break it down, but yet it happens everywhere. And it also results in this sort of thing. This is, how many of you heard about the Steubenville case in the US? It was pretty widely covered. The thing you need to know about this case largely is that there was a girl, they were high school students. The two boys who were the perpetrators were athletic stars. And there's a girl who was very drunk to the point of sort of coming in and out of consciousness, and they were dragging her body from party to party and doing things to it. And this is one of the bystanders to that assault. He was a kid who knew the perpetrators. He didn't participate, but he didn't intervene. And during the court case, he was asked why he didn't intervene, and he said, it did not look like rape. Well, let's think about what he saw. He saw a girl who was naked and drunk, not shielded by innocence, right? And passively not objecting. Commodity model says that's cool, right? Unless we shift to an enthusiastic consent model and lift that innocence frame, we don't see rape when it's in front of us, right? And that's how it keeps happening. The other thing, and this is a brief tangent, we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want, because I don't have time for all of the things. The other thing I would add is he also didn't see it because he expects rapists to look like monsters and not like his friends. And that's another thing that we really have to shift. Now, again, I didn't come here to bum you out, because there's another way. And instead of framing rape or sexual violence as about a violation of innocence, I would like to propose that we frame it as a violation of agency, right? That all of us are imbued with an equal human right to sexual agency. Right? That all of us should be able to be free to be actors on behalf of our own sexual desires and needs, as long as we're not violating anybody else's. My agency stops where yours starts, but we all have equal fields of agency, right? This transforms everything instantly. We're all afforded sort of believability inherently as a right. It also clarifies, I think, a lot of things that get muddled together. So for example, if we focus instead of innocence on agency, we could stop imagining that all sex workers are either happy hookers or trafficked, right? And ask questions about how much agency do they have in both choosing to enter the profession and also in controlling the means of their labor, right? It really reframes that conversation. In order to talk about agency, I think there are two sort of sub-principles that are really important to break out. And the first one is pleasure, right? And again, this is some radical, crazy thing I said earlier, which is that we should all be raised to know that sex can be awesome, right? It sounds so simple, but it would be so transformative, because without talking to young people, right, the whole time about the fact that sex can be one of the best forces in your life, and you have the right to expect it to be awesome, we have a situation in which young women expect sexual violence as normal. This is a huge study that just came out in the US, that young women say, yes, we're grabbed, we're assaulted, but it's not a big deal because they do it to everyone, right? It's normal, right? The reason this is allowed to happen is because these young women are not taught that sex can be for them and can be great. You will have to tell me in the Q&A how sex ed works here. In the US, a lot of times we get abstinence only, which is don't do it. Like, if you do it, you'll be a used up piece of tape that won't bond with your husband. Oh, I could tell you worse stories if you want. You just ask me. The best case scenario is what gets called sort of vernacularly disaster prevention sex ed, right? Which is, you probably shouldn't do it, but if you insist, here's how to not get an infection or get pregnant, right? The problem with disaster prevention sex ed is that it's really heteronormative, right? It mostly focuses on this. And while this is the, at least the motion is the primary way that people possessing of penises get off, it's not the primary way that people possessing of vaginas get off. About 2/3 of women prefer or only get off with clitoral stimulation, right? And I, growing up, didn't learn about the clitoris at all in sex ed because it's only an organ of pleasure. And so if you can't talk about pleasure, you literally can't talk about the clitoris. You can't talk about female pleasure. And it's completely taboo in US sex ed classes. I'm very curious to hear from you about how it is here in the UK. Until we teach young people that under the right circumstances, sex can be great, and so therefore let's talk about what makes circumstances good or what makes you ready, until we prepare young people to make those decisions instead of saying just say no until you're magically 18 or whatever age it is, and then suddenly we expect you to be fully functioning sexual adults even though we've never spoken about it before, we are going to keep having this keep happening. So pleasure is very important. Everyone should know in their bones that they have, that agency means that they should be free to pursue pleasure and that they can. And the other, of course, is power, right? And this can mean, oh wait, yes. My remote was a little behind the slideshow, sorry. This can mean any number of things, right? Power in relation to sexual agency can be about the sort of situation of women in the world versus men, right? There's an inherent gendered power imbalance. This is a marvelous campaign that the UN did last year where they literally just filled in sort of Google autocomplete for women should or women shouldn't, women can, there were a bunch of them, and it reveals a lot, doesn't it? It reveals an enormous amount in a very elegant and succinct way. Until we live in a world where the Google autocomplete doesn't look like this, there's going to be an inherent power imbalance. Does that mean women can't have sexual agency? No, but it does mean that if a woman is having sexual interaction with a man, it's healthy and important to acknowledge that there's a social power imbalance between the two of them about sex. Men are generally, again, there's exception to every rule, and this is probably more applicable to straight men than gay, but I think there's some nuance here, raised to think that sex is about and for them, right? Women, not so much, right? So there's an inherent sort of structural power imbalance when we operate under the commodity model, right? Yeah, this was just last year. This is all still going on. But on the flip side, and of course you can see these structural power imbalances can apply to lots of other things, right? So there's a marvelous essay in Yes Means Yes that I didn't write that the great Tony Amato wrote about queer sex and about how if you've been raised to think of what you want from sex as dirty and bad, then if sex feels bad, that's what you expected, right? So it's another corollary. So you can look at these social dynamics among a lot of different axes of oppression. On the flip side, sort of focusing on the power part of agency can clarify things. So for example, about young people having sex, right? Instead of criminalizing all youth sexuality, what we should be focusing on is adults preying on children, right? You know, if there's a huge age gap, if a 25-year-old person is going after a 14-year-old, that's a power imbalance that can't be overcome, right? But when young people are having sex with each other, it often falls under that criminalization umbrella, and that's actually how young people are supposed to learn and explore, right? And so when we see that young people have equal power to each other, because they're relative, at least on the age spectrum, we can see, oh, this is great, this is agency, right? There's agency here, where even though this person is the same age, and they might have not have agency in respect to somebody else. Is this making sense? Great. This, I should have said in the beginning, this sort of innocence versus agency framework is something I've been thinking about for a long time, but this is the first time I'm doing it in a talk, so I'm curious to hear how it lands and how you want to nuance and push it forward. So, yes, pleasure and power equals agency. That's my little... So, the last section I want to talk about before we all sit down to talk together is, what do we do about it, right? How do we make change? And I'm going to propose 3 levels, the first of which is on the individual level. I really genuinely believe that resisting the dominant sexual commodified paradigm is an act of political resistance. It will also make your sex life better, right? So you don't have to do it as an act of political resistance. If you just want to do it because you want to be a good person and great in bed, like, please be my guest. But the more we resist, the less this narrative has control of us, and the more we each develop equal agency, right? So developing your own agency in resistance to a culture that doesn't want you to can be a profound act, and that's also why it can be difficult, and I want to validate that along the way. So what do we do? Here are just some thoughts about how to start to tease your own sexual agency out from what the world has taught you. And I should say, the goal is never to become uninfluenced, right? You will be like an amoeba on the floor if you try to be free of all your influences, or else you'll just start acting in resistance to all your influences, which is just being influenced by them in a different way. The goal is instead to become aware of the ways you've been influenced by the culture and the institutions that you've grown up with, and your family and all of these things, and to decide which of those influences are working for you and which ones aren't, and to try and figure out ways to turn up the volume on the ones that work for you and turn down the volume on the ones that don't, right? So it's not about being free of influence. It's impossible. Please don't make yourself crazy. Here are some very practical ideas. We have to start separating feeling afraid from being afraid when it comes to sex, right? So some things make us feel very safe that make us and other people less safe. For example, I happen to think that a lot of times when women victim blame other women who are victims of sexual violence, it's because it makes us feel safe, right? That we imagine there's some checklist that we can check off, and if we do all these things right or don't do these things, that we won't be violated. And that makes us feel safe, and so if we see that someone has been violated, we have to find what they violated on that checklist to reinforce that we can be in control. Now, that makes life less safe for all the victims who can't get justice and healing because they're getting blamed and the rapists are getting let back into the community, and it therefore makes all of us less safe because there are more rapists not being held accountable, right? So it makes us feel safe in the moment, it makes us all less safe. On the other hand, there are things that make us feel terrified that might make us safer. So for example, talking to your partners about sex, right? Might be a very scary proposition, but can make you and your partner much safer, as well as making you a better lay, which I think is also valid to talk about. So we have to tease those things out. Just because you feel afraid doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. Just because you feel safe doesn't mean it is the right thing to do. Tease those things out. You're smart enough to do it. We have to reclaim sexual experimentation. Right? You are like the future leaders of England here, I'm given to understand, right? I'm sure everyone is telling you to take bold risks, right? And if you fail up, and you learn, and nothing ventured, nothing gained, and all of that stuff, except for sex, right? And especially except for sex for women. Then, if you do something sexual and you have a bad feeling about it, it is the end of the world. And the number one way that we're supposed to run our sex lives is risk-free. Which is a myth, right? There is no risk-free way to have a sex life. Literally. Honestly, even choosing abstinence, which, by the way, I talked a little bit about abstinence only. If abstinence is the thing that works for you, like, I'm all for it. I'm just not for it being a one-size-fits-all prescription. Even choosing abstinence has risks. It has emotional risks, right? You might miss out on a connection that you really wanted to have. You might decide that you no longer want to be abstinent, and then you can't find a sexual partner. Any number of things could happen, right? It doesn't mean it's a bad decision. It just means every decision has risks. And the important thing to do, instead of creating a list of do's and don'ts, is to teach people, starting with young people, how to make decisions for themselves. So, by a show of hands, how many of you think this looks like fun? And how many of you think this looks like a terrible idea? Okay. How many of you judge someone who answered differently than you did? Got a judgy pants in the back, but the rest of you are okay. Right, we don't tend to judge each other's risk when it comes to leisure or recreational behaviors except for sex, right? And if somebody comes along and cuts this person's bungee cord, are we going to say, well, they were engaged in a risky behavior, what did they expect? No, of course not. We're going to get them some medical help and try and track down the asshole who did it, right? Of course we are. Because engaging in something that has some inherent risks doesn't mean when somebody else violates you, it's your fault. Everyone understand the metaphor? Am I being unclear? So I propose that what we should be teaching starting at a very young age, obviously in age-appropriate ways, is instead of do this, don't do that, or mostly don't do that, how to do a risk and reward evaluation for yourself, right? So if you're facing any kind of sexual decision, to ask, what are the things that could go wrong here? What are the things that could go wrong emotionally, physically, socially, financially, whatever, right? What are the bad things that could happen? You may have to do research on this stuff because you've been fed a bunch of propaganda and not all of it is true, and then there are some risks that you don't hear about, right? So this is a learning process. And also the risks are going to be different from different people depending on social location, right? So that's also real and painful and means we have to continue to do anti-oppression work broadly, right? What are the bad things that could happen? How bad would they be for me personally, right? Everyone's going to have a different answer to that. How much do I value these things not happening? How likely are they to happen? And are there things that I can do to reduce the odds of these bad things happening, right? Now, probably you've heard about a risk assessment before. This sounds sort of familiar, but a lot of times when it comes to sex, we definitely leave out the other half, which is a reward assessment, right? Don't stop at the risk assessment with all the scary stuff. What are the good things that could happen? What are the awesome things that might happen if I make this sexual decision? How important are they to me? How likely are they to happen? And how can I increase the odds that they happen, right? Once you have thought about those questions, you get to make the call, and everyone in here is going to make a slightly different set of decisions, right? Just like some of you want to go bungee jumping and some of you don't. And if one of you is engaging in a risky behavior, which is bullshit, because all of you will be, right? Just a different set of risks. You're not going to say, oh, well, there was a risk, so therefore anything bad that happened to you is your fault, right? Because you're going to recognize now that everyone is engaging in risks, and that doesn't mean it's okay for people to hurt us. So that is the individual level. That's sort of my advice about sort of reclaiming our agency on the individual. I want to talk a little bit about how to do it on the level of sort of media and culture. And then we're going to talk very briefly as a sort of end note about policy. I realize now that I forgot to hook this up to sound, so we're going to have to skip the couple of videos that are in here. That's my fault. I didn't ask about it. This is a video that you can find on Funny or Die that was made when Skins was imported to the US. And we have an organization called the Parents Television Council whose job is to freak out about things. And they freaked out about how much youth sexuality was depicted in Skins. And this was a very funny video of sort of basically teenagers being like, oh, thanks, Parents Television Council, for telling us there's lots of nudity and crazy stuff in Skins. We're totally tuning in, right? And I put this in here to sort of point to one of the sort of pitfalls that we can fall into when we engage in cultural pushback on the commodity model, which is to get into that punitive, don't look at this mode, right? A, it never works, and B, it's a slippery slope, and a lot of times the Parents Television Council is objecting to stuff that I think is really healthy. Like, there's a moment on a television show I watched where, you know, a teenage girl was telling another teenage boy about how girls actually like sex just as much as boys, and you should be aware of that, right? The Parents Television Council freaked out, right? So, like, let's not be the Parents Television Council. It's just like taking somebody's toys away. It's never going to get anywhere. Come on, video. The other reason is because it's a slippery slope, right? It's a really messy argument. There are some things that feel super cut and dry, and that's fine. But there's also a lot of stuff that's kind of gray. We don't know if we should object to it or how, right? So when Beyonce did this performance at, was it the VMAs, the MTV Awards? I forget, the Grammys, one of those things. As she does anytime she does something sexy on a large stage, some segment of the population freaks out and says, Beyonce is sexualized, and she's telling women that their only value is in being sexy, and it's a bad message. And then another group says, Beyonce is depicting, you know, empowered female sexual agency, and she's in control, and all of that. And honestly, we could have a real good conversation about that, right? You know, and then, of course, race comes into, like, is Beyonce being policed in a way that Lady Gaga doesn't get policed? And, you know, it's a very messy conversation. And so, when we make ourselves sort of the police of what's harmful, it can be we have to tread carefully, right? This image can mean different things to different people, and that's true. That's just inherently true. It's sending a different message to different people in this room right now. And so it's not a winning proposition to spend most of our energy trying to crack down on stuff. Instead, I think the cultural resistance should be trying to make and popularize more images of agency. Right? So I like to use Beth Ditto as an example, right? Here's a woman who doesn't look like she has a body that tends to get valued in the commodity model. She's completely unashamed. You might say this is a little sexualized in that she's half naked, but she's also giving you a pretty fierce look, isn't she? And also sometimes on stage she does this and just sort of like wears her Spanx and doesn't give a shit. And I think that's also pretty powerful at the same, to be both things at the same time, right? We see pushback happening on ads. So there's a trend now of sort of putting men in the silly positions that women are made to take in ads to sort of reveal how ridiculous they are. This was circulating recently. There's also a great website, if you like this, called the Hawkeye Project, Hawkeye something, where they do this with comics. So, you know, if you see female comic action stars and they're like looking at you sexily over their butt, and they put all the male superheroes in those positions, and you can see exactly how ridiculous it is. We have movies coming out that are starting to push the envelope. Last summer, we had the To-Do List. Did you have that over here? With Aubrey Plaza, which was about a young a high school senior who realized that she was not as sexually experienced as she wanted to be, and she wanted to have some experience before she went off to college, and she was sort of type A and made like a checklist, and like, but she also learned something about other people's agency along the way. I don't want to spoil it, but it was really transgressive. It was like a gross out sex comedy with a female protagonist. We usually only see those with men. So there are pushbacks there. There's also art. This is an amazing artist called Faviana Rodriguez, who does very confrontational work. I own this poster. So this can look a lot of different ways. And this is a video that we're going to skip. So, the last thought I want to leave you with, and I should say that this is slightly outside of my expertise. I tend to be a culture change activist. I tend to consult with people who work on policy, but policy isn't my bailiwick. So if there are policy people in the room, I want to hear from you. But I do want to point out that there are some policies already in place and initiatives where we can very easily dovetail sort of sexual agency and inherent sexual human rights. So these are the Millennium Development Goals at the UN. And you'll notice that, and these are basically supposed to all be achieved by 2015, which, wah, wah. But people are working on them, and they're accepted. Literally every country at the UN has signed on to them, right? So all the countries are supposed to be working on some of them, right? And fully 4 of them are connected quite directly to sexual agency and sexual rights, and that if we put that framework under them, we would stop seeing these as 4 different goals, right? And instead we would see them as 4 different awesome outcomes of promoting the idea of sexual human rights. I'm going to leave that thought, that sort of big, optimistic thought there. I want to give you my contact information if you want to be in contact further or follow me on social media or check out other of my writing. And again, I want to thank you for this incredible honor of addressing you here tonight.